hope everybody had a lovely Easter. All right. Okay, so we're just at the hour, so I'll go ahead and call up our meditation. There you go. So, Christine, I greet Christ in you and welcome you back again to our time today. So let us pray. May it be, O God, that I know the meaning of moderation. Moderation in all things, all ways, all actions. May I live and walk, may I eat and sleep in moderation. May I work and rest, may I study and toil in moderation. May I know the meaning of moderation in all things, all ways, all actions, except love. Amen. So our first reading this morning continues in chapter 4 and begins on 123. We're moving into a section here called the Royal Way. Despite occasional historical excesses, the Desert Mothers and Fathers adopted relatively modest ascetical practices. We even read of cautionary tales warning that ascesis or the ardent memorization of long scriptural passages cannot themselves become replacements for an authentic embodiment of the gospel. Abba Pullman, one of the most cited monks in the sayings of the Desert Fathers, was particularly known for his moderate approach to asceticism, which he called the Royal Way. This was a reference to Numbers 20:17, in which Moses sought to lead Israel through the Transjordan by a wide, easily accessible route of the same name. For Pullman, this royal way provided a metaphor for a way of asceticism that was accessible to a wide range of people, not merely to a few spiritual elites. And quoting here, Abba Joseph asked Abba Pullman, "How should one fast?" And Abba Pullman said to him, "For my part, I think it's better that one should eat every day, but only a little, so as not to be satisfied." Abba Joseph said to him, "When you were younger, did you not fast 2 days at a time, Abba?" The old man said, "Yes, even for 3 days and 4 and the whole week." The fathers tried all this out as they were able, and they found it preferable to eat every day, but just a small amount. They have left us this royal way, which is light. That brings us to our meditation this morning. Second reading comes also from page 123. If at times ascetical practices have tended toward excess, we should not forget this broader history of moderation when examining approaches to asceticism today. It seems, however, that in modern consumerist societies, we are in little danger of falling into such excesses. To the contrary, what passes as asceticism today has been largely reduced in the popular mind to giving up cigarettes, coffee, or sweets for Lent, often with ulterior motives, such as losing weight, starting a new health kick, or getting back in shape. While these goals are noble in themselves, the spiritual value of the royal way has been all but lost. Most notably, ascesis has become largely unmoored from contemplative prayer, even though historically the two were inseparable. Indeed, they are extensions of one another. That Brings us to our closing prayer. God, let me not trust in the excesses of my efforts, but rest in you who accomplishes in me what I cannot do of my own accord. Amen. So it's been a couple of weeks since we've been together, and we continue moving our way through the chapter on asceticism, essentially chapter 4. And as always, I open the floor to any questions or comments you may have. Just a notice in the chat box from Marcia. I don't believe we're repeating any of what we did. I think we're just continuing with Abba Pullman, who I've cited before. Hi, Nicola, go right ahead. Nicola, I think you're still muted. I think you might have turned off your camera instead of unmute.
Thank you. So here I am. Can we put this in some kind of current context in terms of being the war in Ukraine and the heaviness of all of that, and somehow trying to apply these principles to that?
Yeah, it's a great question. As you know, something I've read now, probably what goes back a few months ago or just several pages ago, was from a British Carmelite nun, Ruth Burrows, who really talks about the idea that none of our ascetical practices, particularly those that we choose, have nearly the value of those practices that are thrust on us, and that essentially they're worthless if they're not inculcating or giving us a greater capacity to love our neighbor. That all of the ascetical practices that we do are really about the love of neighbor. And so very often it's the neighbor, either the neighbor in need or the neighbor who for various reasons is problematic or difficult, that these are the invitations to asceticism and to ascetical practice that are far more of value to us than the things I mentioned here, like giving up cigarettes or chocolate and so forth. So the question, I suppose, from an ascetical question is might be posed is what does the war in Ukraine evoke in us by way of a neighbor in need, especially a neighbor in which we're talking about an international relationship, not one that is local or familial or communal, but which is so much bigger than any of that, which is involving governments from around the world and so forth. And so I think that there's only the only connection we might draw is one that is limited by what we as individuals can do to love the people of Ukraine, essentially. What does that look like in such a huge global upset of geopolitical power and of the the incursion of a sovereign nation by another, and what is, I think, universally agreed to be an illegal war. And what does it mean right now for us to love Ukraine and to love Russia into a place of conversion from this? And my sense is that while there are certainly pragmatic things that we can do to support Ukrainians, we've probably all read about the various undertakings, people booking Airbnbs that they're not using and so forth to help funnel money into the country, for example, these types of very concrete actions. On many levels, what we can do, I think, pragmatically are quite limited. It's just a situation that's well beyond the control of any individual citizen. So at the end of this chapter, I'm going to explore sort of three ways of concretizing the concept or the theory around ascetical practice. The first one, looking at what it means to see those who are in my direct contact, how, as Ruth Burroughs would say, what it means to love them, who are, directly associated with me, with whom I have actual relationships. Secondly, a level out from that, what does it look like for me to live in such a way that I help to cultivate a world that is one of peace and of justice, so that all people around the world have the same capacity for growth and self-fulfillment and so on. That's how we kind of love the stranger, love people we never met, in a sense, how we love Ukrainians, or how we even love Russians through this crisis. And then is the third invitation will be essentially vigil keeping, which is the ascetical practice that I do when I can't do anything else, when I'm really powerless to change a situation, and to really stress that is not doing nothing, that is really a commitment to a sustained attention on prayerfulness for openness to what opportunities might come my own way, but a real solidarity with, by not flinching or turning or ignoring the horrors we're seeing unfold. And I would say that in some levels, it's these last two, how I work toward a just world, how I keep vigil with those who are suffering when I'm beyond the power to do anything, that most, I would say, are things that we can do. And unfortunately, it's precisely in that powerlessness that so much of the Christian life, even the cross, what we saw, we just observed on Good Friday, the whole way of God's being in the world is so much about keeping vigil. And how do we do that attentively and with an awareness of opportunities that might arise for something that's more engaged? And unfortunately, in a situation that's as big as this is, I'm not sure there's much more individuals can do. And staying alert and aware and informed is not small.
No, it's very wearying.
It is very wearying. And one of the reasons that I talk about, that the sort of vocation of the contemplative is to learn to live with, to increase our capacity to live with a broken heart, is precisely addressing that wearisome quality of remaining so attentive to the suffering of a whole country, and the emotional, psychological effects that has on us as individuals. It's disheartening and overwhelming and depressing and discouraging. And but if we, because of that, turn away or build a fortress or become callous, we've really lost our capacity to remain both compassionate, but also our capacity to remain open to whatever might come our way that could open us to some action that is beyond prayerful solidarity, say. But it's a terrible, terrible situation to watch unfold. I wish I had something more pragmatic, but I think in the midst of that, Nikolai, I think is where so much of what we're seeing in the world is in that last category of keeping vigil. and how we learn to live with a broken heart, and how we continue to work in our own way and context where we do have power to make sure that we are making choices that are just and compassionate, and creating, a society and a global society that is as just as possible. It's very discouraging. The model that God gives us in the cross, though, is encouraging.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for your question. David, good morning.
Good morning. There have been times in my life when I've felt called to pray for a particular concern by fasting as a form of intercessory prayer. And I guess that comes from those words of Jesus: this can only come out through prayer and fasting. And so I just invite you to reflect about that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Well, you remember Gandhi used fasting as an ascetical practice with great political implications for getting two sides of, two warring factions to come together. And aside from those immediate political sort of implications that someone of his stature might be able to bring about because of his own fasting, there is indeed a way in which we, that's one of the things I've tried to suggest in the second paragraph, that while we tend to, I think, mistakenly look back to ascetical practices as if the church was particularly in centuries past extreme, I think we struggle with the opposite today. We struggle with not wanting to be uncomfortable, not wanting to fast, not wanting to feel to really engage in any kind of deprivation of any kind of the body. So I think there's very little danger currently, and for most of us in a society that's so consumeristic, of over extending our ascetical practices, but re-engaging some of those where the hunger itself becomes, for example, an incarnate or bodily reminder of my solidarity or my hunger for justice or for peace, et cetera, and those more ephemeral or less carnal desires, I think has tremendous value for keeping us alert and attentive to, in this case, say, going back to Nicola's question, to the crisis we're seeing unfold there and the real travesty of it.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. Christine, good morning.
Good morning, Father Vincent and everyone. I just want to speak to what you said about keeping vigil and the power of that. Last night, I went to see the opera Dead Man Walking. Perhaps we all remember the story of the nun who sat vigil with and prayed with and for a convicted criminal who refused to admit his complicity in the murder of two young people. And it was only through her love and perseverance in being present to him that he was finally able to admit his sin and ask for forgiveness. It is a very, very powerful thing. So when we go into this keeping vigil, I think we really need to be encouraged and know how powerful it is. It's not a little thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Christine. I don't think we've gotten to it yet, but we'll soon. And I believe it's out of, it's a citation from Macarius about when we keep vigil and when we hold the world in prayer, that there are times the Spirit raises us to great joy, and other times, to deep sadness and grief over the suffering in the world. And that he talks about how we hold both victim and perpetrator without distinguishing in our prayer. And that's very difficult to do when we're watching, for example, in Ukraine, what perpetration looks like and the horrors it's bringing about. How do we hold that? But of course, the point that he's making is that prayer is not something we dole out to someone as a reward. In this case, we're praying for them because they're so desperately in need of seeing in their own hearts what it is that they're doing and the atrocities that they're carrying out. So there is as much a prayer on behalf of Ukrainians as for Russia in terms of a conversion of its heart and its war policies and so forth. That we have to hold the humanity of all of that together in some great unified way of praying. Macarius is very clear about that, and no doubt it's difficult at times. Yeah. Andrew, good morning.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Very good. Just on this vigiling, something I discovered 5-6 years ago. I was sitting with a dying friend, and it's an ongoing Christian tradition of being with dying people, and I just noticed myself. He was like in and out of consciousness. I noticed myself that I was breathing in sync with Leonard. It kind of hit me. Well, that is what vigiling is all about. Is basically inspiring, breathing together.
Mm-hmm.
And as you were reflecting, I got thinking, well, basically vigiling is just simply breathing with Ukraine or breathing with, Russia even. But it's just, my breathing as prayer, as vigil. And for me, that just really opened up a whole new way of looking and experiencing vigiling. Thank you.
Yeah, that's very beautiful. Yeah, thank you for that. How we just, to breathe with one another. It's beautiful. And some of you probably know that the word inspiration is very deeply tied to the notion of breathing. So thank you, Andrew, for that. I think one of the goals that I had in writing this chapter was to not only show, I guess, the spiritual or theological value of re-examining this otherwise unpopular concept of asceticism, but also to Andrew's point, to recognize on some level the real value of these practices for a rich and authentic spiritual life, which is why I refer to it more as the practice of the reclamation of beauty, rather than anything that would be, body hating or putting ourselves into these extreme sort of conditions or practices. And we see within Buddhism the middle way that the Buddha himself discovered along his various extremes of engaging in the world or disengaging from the world, and fasting and feasting. And in Thailand some years ago, when Fernando and I were visiting, there's this beautiful temple which shows all these statues of the Buddha in these various stages, from being so emaciated from his excessive fasting and so on, but kind of culminates in that Buddha who is very serene and calm in that moderate middle way. And it's interesting to me that as we explore in this section the royal way that the Desert Fathers took, how similar in two separate traditions that notion of both persistent asceticism that is integral to prayer, but also one that is by intention moderate, I think is so important for us to understand. Punishing the body, all these extremes that we could take ourselves to, don't really, as the wisdom of both these traditions show, don't really inculcate love in us. And that's why there's this more centrist approach is what's so important. Because it's the love they draw us to, the way they teach us to love, that ultimately matters, not this spiritual athleticism in which we can prove ourselves or gain worthiness or make ourselves more spiritually elite, which is more what these extremes tend to have in mind, either consciously or half consciously. The idea is that it's steady as you go, moderation in all things, and that leads us to a greater capacity to love. Roger, please.
I was just wondering if the concept of asceticism could be applied to emotional states like anger and jealousy, and possibly even states that we consider positive, like love.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The opening prayer this morning was a little bit of a variation on a theme. In the rule of Benedict, he says, moderation in all things except prayer, which I altered to moderation in all things except love, and perhaps those are different ways of saying the same thing. But I do think that there's a reciprocity. I think not only do intentional practices of asceticism moderate our emotions, or the vast fluctuation of those emotions, the extremes, for example, but the opposite is true as well, right? That we can practice a degree of moderation around particularly emotional extremes that I would say are negative, in order to bring us to a place that is more tranquil, to use the Eastern term, more hesychastic, right? More of that inner tranquility. And I'm not trying to suggest that the contemplative should be one who has is sort of more like a zombie with no states of fluctuation in their emotion, or kind of has this, as if they've had some kind of lobotomy. I think the idea is more that we find a way to moderate, particularly those excesses like anger or rage or resentment, and those types of things that can be controlling, in a way that the very practice on the one hand is recognizing them and reining them in, or detaching from those extremes. And I would only apply that to what we might think of as positive things only in regard to excesses that are, I wouldn't want to argue that one can be too happy, for example. I think that it's more the case that we would want to rein in the excessive pursuit of pleasure, for example, which can become a distraction, even though it feels wonderful, or, as opposed to something like a negative emotion like anger or rage or resentment and so forth. So the idea is not to come to a flatline personality, but to understand how, like all of our aspects of our person, can be put under the reign of the true self, like the ego, as we talked about a few chapters earlier. There's nothing wrong with the ego. It's a neutral tool. Question is it being governed by true self or false self? And that's where we get into trouble with the ego. Emotions as well. How are they filtered through or moderated by this attentive practice? It's one of the reasons why, centering prayer, or in my own life, the Jesus prayer, has such a powerful capacity to serve like a filter. If you can pray your prayer phrase, your phrase or word, or the Jesus prayer into a given situation, it almost serves like a filter to determine a kind of sense of where is the appropriateness of this to the spiritual life. That I think it's reciprocal. We can modulate emotions as ascetical practice, and ascetical practice leads to a certain modulation by which those negative extremes become less pronounced, and excesses of pleasure seeking become less important or have less of a hold. I don't know if that answers your question, Roger, but that's sort of my take on where I might go with that. I wonder if, as we come to the hour, if we don't want to look a little bit at practice. I know it's 3 weeks ago. Carmen, I wonder, would you, I don't have the ability to read that now. Would you like to voice what you wrote there, or is it just easier for you to have in writing?
Sure, I can. You mentioned practical and vigiling. And so it would be remiss to not say that today is Holy Saturday on the Julian calendar. And so the Easter Vigil is tonight for Orthodox Christians celebrating, for the 23 countries, of which Ukraine is one, Eastern Catholics, the Eastern lung, if you will, we're talking about breathing, lung of the Big C Catholic Church, those 23 churches being the Eastern lung. And that one country, Ukraine, of course, going through what you're talking about as we began with the war, and thank you. An unprecedented Easter, except for World War II. So it's very practical that you're walking with us, walking with them, and any of you, some of you have mentioned those you know who are walking, and it's very local for some of us, walking with family, friends, colleagues. So wholly holding it all and being able to pray with you and hear you in your pain, and Mary at the foot of the cross sorrowing, like one of our pieces. Hearing your sorrow is helpful to us as we carry others' sorrows that we're directly in communication with, or sharing the links when composers have passed through this war, as some of us have been. So that's real practical, and it is real local across our country. We breathe better. And I came upon yesterday at 71st and Madison here in New York, St. James Episcopal. They're flying the blue and yellow flag in solidarity right out front. And they have a huge poster. I don't know if you can see. This is their poster. And it says about, it's the blue and yellow flag again. So they have the flag out front flying with the US flag, one on each side. And they're, I don't know what you call it, you know, that billboard under glass, which says pray for peace, work for justice. So it was really nice that, so we're talking about the 23 Eastern Catholic churches, and that when the West and East breathe together, not so good at it, learning about each other, but working on it, the whole body breathes together. So that's intra, right, the faith tradition, and our interfaith, but that really touched our hearts. Not even our Roman Catholic Strong Peace and Justice parish is flying the flag or has evidence. It was kind of Herculean. Our last name's Herculean, so we call Herculean. To kind of get it mentioned, you know, along with other wars, of course, but it's kind of turned into a bit of an issue of well, they're all white, because of course we have preference for the poor, so it's become sort of a, what do you call it, a reverse prejudice or reverse racism, which is kind of wild, but we don't even have an evidence there, so we're trying to, sometimes it feels like work with kindergarten to invite that change, but there we were, kind of like welcome prayer, you know, you give it up and it comes from another place, and there, the Episcopal Church, flying wide and high in solidarity, warmed our hearts, as you are when you even speak about what's happening in the beautiful ways that you all do. So thank you. We are vigiling literally, because we're by ritual. So we're vigiling literally and also figuratively, blessing, taking that joy of Eastertide from our Western way and with you all, and tying that as we wholly hold the dark, the light, and the gray. So Roman, did you want to add anything?
No.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. But it is so practical, and the vigiling is very current and always.
Oh, I'll ask it.
Oh,
I have a question about
Sure.
the asceticism, and I was so struck a couple of weeks or months ago when you talked about the difference between athleticism and asceticism, and athleticism helping us to be victorious, and asceticism helping us to be defeated. You know, and then in that defeat to rely on God. And I think you made the tie in St. Paul and his thorn, and so I'm just wondering if you would comment on that in regards to what we've spoken of this morning.
Yes, of course. So thank you both for your comments. And then Roman, to your question, there etymologically, the two words are indeed, they share the same root, as you can probably even hear in the English pronunciation of them, athleticism and asceticism. But to your point, indeed, the athlete is the one who's, let's say proverbial, learning how to run the race and win the race. And asceticism really teaches us how to fall and how to understand that we can't save ourselves. And it's the thing that becomes more of, I would say, a healthy humiliation, which we only learn by doing, that we just simply cannot be perfect, and we're not perfect. And the freedom that we arrive at is the realization, A, that we're not perfect, A, that we constantly fall and stumble just by virtue of being human. And that it is our job to learn then to give over to Christ, as it were, rather than to continue to try to save ourselves. In Romans 7, Paul really grapples with this very idea of realizing I try and I try and I try and I can't save myself. Who will save me from this body that keeps, screwing up all the time? And this becomes a very liberating moment for Paul, to recognize that you don't have to save yourself, that God, to use the other analogy we've talked about months ago, that God is the one who rushes out to greet us, who actually picks us up and carries us home. And we can talk about that even in terms of enlightenment, and that, there is, I would say not even enlightenment in Christianity, because enlightenment to me always marks a kind of success at an effort toward something. And that success is won for us. And in that sense, we are brought home. We don't find enlightenment, we're carried to it in a sense. And, in that beautiful film, which also looks at the terrible war going on in El Salvador in the 80s with Oscar Romero, who was a very bookish, and therefore they thought a kind of innocuous placeholder as the bishop there for the duration of this otherwise politically fraught time, who is the one who really dives in and begins holding a voice for the poor and the oppressed in that particular context against the government, and as you all know, is ultimately killed for it. But there's a wonderful moment in that film where he literally just is alone and falls to his knees and says, "I can't, you must." And this is the moment of his real conversion as it's depicted. It's that moment where he realizes he can't do anymore, but keep vigil, but remain in solidarity. And in that comes his great power and as a visionary spiritual leader and political leader who helps carry the people through. And, his own sort of assessment, if you kill me, I will rise again in the El Salvadorian people, which essentially is what happens. And so there is a connection then to understanding as an individual citizen my incapacity really to change the outcome of what's happening in any immediate way in the Ukraine. And so what is that proverbial falling to our knees and saying, "I can't, you must. I give this over to you. And I'm doing what I can in my own small corner of the world." But we're asking, we're begging, we're demanding justice here. We're demanding compassion. We're demanding conversion. So I think there for me is that overriding connection, is to recognize that in powerlessness, Christ is victorious, right? One of the things that next month, I'm going to be giving a 2-hour lecture on the theory of atonement known as Christus Victor. It's coming up, I think, a month from today. We'll be advertising that very soon. But one of the beautiful aspects of that theory that's so powerful is the idea that the cross is a powerful image of reconciliation and overcoming the forces of sin and death and Satan, as it's depicted. Those, in other words, those forces of evil in the world. But what makes it so powerful is that God cannot overcome even those forces through violence or war, because that in itself is contrary to the divine nature. So God needs to, in a sense, to put it simply, devise a way, a nonviolent way of overcoming the evil in the world. And this is what we see unfolding in the cross, so that rather than impose violence on the enemies of God, sin, death, Satan, God takes upon himself, right, in this Trinitarian love, the weight of that in order to overcome them non-violently, because God cannot ultimately be violent. There's a beautiful theory that really tries to look both at the notion of atonement from not the wrath of God on Jesus, where as if they're somehow put into opposition with one another, but seeing the whole process of redemption as a Trinitarian process of God taking on God's self, this darkness, through weakness, through failure, through defeat, through death, non-violently overcoming the very powers that seek to destroy. And so there again is a model of solidarity that is rooted in the non-violence of the Christian God. Thanks, Roman.
Can I just give one quickie tied into that, Father? And that is, I'll put it in the link, but for those of you who know about the activist John Deere, he's done Ukraine and the nonviolent alternative. One of our nonviolent teachers reached out to him and said early on, kind of in the war, what about what's going on in Ukraine? And this was his response. So it's about an hour long. I'll just write that down here. But it was very interesting in terms of nonviolent activists that are in Ukraine that we didn't know about. And of course that the press doesn't give any heed to that aspect. But anyway, that's just out there in tandem with your wonderful offer.
Thank you, Carmen. Yeah, I'll look for that on the chat box. Let's see, Sue. Sorry for the wait. Go right ahead.
Yeah, what's coming up for me as I've been listening is how I really want to pray and keep vigil that I and everybody will just feel completely and totally overwhelmed by God's love. And that's what I don't know, it's just really speaking to me. And this Easter, I asked to be shown, what is this crucifixion about? What does God, what do I, show me something for me afresh and new this year? And it doesn't sound new, but it feels new. It just feels like no matter what, here is love for you. No matter what, here is love for you. And I don't know, it just feels so important to me. I feel I want to say things that might sound like I'm criticizing other people, but it just feels really important to me. I remember years ago when I watched Dead Man Walking, I just remembered the nun loving him no matter what. And in his moment of fear, when he was able to acknowledge his fear and lack of love, that he was then open to receive it. And it just feels really important to me. So I'm hoping that God will help me to continue in that way of being and praying. But it just feels, I worked with guys in prison, and I just feel it's important to begin by saying you're loved rather than you're bad, and make amends from that place. How about you're loved, and trust that from knowing that we're loved, all we will do is love in return. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Sylvia, please.
What a wonderful discussion again. I'm so glad we're back together. Thank you. I wanted to hear your thoughts on the extravagance of nature and the extravagance of certain commitments that the human world, human community, or individuals can make to sacrifice themselves for a child or a partner in ways that are certainly anything but the middle way. And nature with its, dozens or thousands of seeds or dozens of offspring, when there are only going to be one or two that survive, or arise as whatever the seed is. And so there seems to be, and I'm not trying to be contrary here, but there seems to be a way of extreme generosity and giving and self-emptying. I'm also thinking of in among us humans and in the animal world, where there's total sacrifice, where the mother will throw herself in front of the bus and toss the child to the side. Or recently here in Olima, there was a house fire that engulfed the house so quickly, and there was two dogs in the house, a Chihuahua and then a larger 30 or 40 pound mutt, and there was an open window, and the Chihuahua could not jump out of the window. It was too small, but the larger dog easily could have, but they found them both dead, and the larger dog was completely lying on top of the Chihuahua, protecting her. And so that's, just such an act of self-giving in the most generous possible way. And so I wondered what you could say about that.
Yeah, it's an interesting comment. I do think it's really talking about a different thing than asceticism, as say Abba Pullman is talking about it. The kind of extravagance, even that we talked about, for example, in our understanding of the prodigal son, which I think is better named prodigal father, the extravagance of that love, right, is to be witnessed throughout creation, in the various ways you've said, among many, many others. But I think that that's a different call or a different giftedness. What the royal way is trying to, I guess, instill in contemplative practitioners is to avoid the excesses that would not be excesses of, say, extravagance or heroism or generativity or generosity, but the excesses of ascetical practices that are self-imposed, that would say be, fasting or self-flagellating or sleep deprivation. It's those types of things that for various reasons, usually born of scrupulosity or excessive sort of false piety and so on, that have become temptations within the life of prayer and practice that are really counterproductive. That's a very different thing than being generous, for example, in love and so on, or the kinds of generativity you're talking about we see in nature. And that's why, whether you look at the rule of Benedict or my take on it, there is always that exception of that middle way when you're talking about prayer, or what I think is, in my own sort of interpretation of that, embodied love, that there you see no moderation, right? But it's the moderation of these other things that allow for the excessiveness or the extravagance of being a loving individual by moderating these things. Otherwise, these ascetical practices become ends in themselves. Look at me, I'm a spiritual elite. I can fast for a week, and I spend 20 minutes before bedtime, beating myself up or whatever. These tend to lead toward very unhealthy ways of being self-obsessed rather than loving and generative, rather than, say, self-forgetful. And I think that's what the cautionary tale is here, is not that we shouldn't be excessive in love or in generativity, but that we shouldn't be excessive in those practices that can too easily become self-focused rather than self-forgetful. I think we might see a parallel in that, in the way today so much of the mindfulness, the multi-billion-dollar industry of mindfulness, by the way, has developed itself, is around aligning my chakras and getting better sleep and living with less stress and having better eating habits. It suddenly is all focused on me, on my eating, my habits, my stress levels, my productivity at work. There's something antithetical to that focus that is not all of mindfulness, but in much, there's a whole subset of mindfulness that focuses entirely on that, that really is antithetical to the self-forgetfulness that asceticism is really about, which is the place from which I love extravagantly. And there's, as you said, Sylvia, there's, examples throughout nature which serve as teachers for that kind of extravagance that is beautiful. And not merely self-obsessed or scrupulous or kind of carrying forward a kind of false piety that really makes me more about myself than about forgetfulness, where I can become more detached and as more detached, become more extravagantly generative or generous. Do you see that distinction?
Yes, I do. And so then how I'm seeing ascetical practices for myself, it's another way to be aware of myself as a channel for God's love, as a becoming conscious member of the body of Christ, and that at a certain point, ascetical practices, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this too, are really training wheels, because we graduate from needing ascetical practices to the degree that we are open moment by moment in the present to our conscious awareness as arising expressions of the divine, as members of the infinite body of Christ and God, as co-arising members of this incredible physical world, and that when open enough, the spontaneous awareness is that I don't have to really think about how to be or what to do, that the harmonizing gift of my being is present, and I'll know this food is for me, this action is for me, this direction of my attention is how I can be the greatest blessing. And
Right.
it becomes automatic isn't the right word. It just becomes innate in a flow.
Second nature.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's, I think that's right. And that, the shorthand way, I think, of saying what you're expressing there is that we always have to remember that ascetical practice, like our centering prayer, even like our meditation, are means to an end, not ends in themselves. That they're means to. One of the things we see in Meister Eckhart is through his sermons and a few of his treatises, is the insistence that the greatest Christian virtue is not love, it's detachment. Because he says, without true detachment, unending love cannot happen. And one of the examples he would provide is to say, even if you have a page in a codex or in a book on which is written a beautiful poem, as beautiful as that poem may be, there's no room on that page now for anything else. And so even the most beautiful and sublime becomes an attachment to something. This is why he's critical of the previous interpretations of the Mary Martha story, to say, Mary has chosen the better part, which is to suggest, yes, prayer is indeed the center of the Christian life and therefore the better part. But what he criticizes is that Mary, he says, is still attached to the bliss of meditation. And as noble as that is, as beautiful and wonderful as that attachment is, the blissful attachment to sit at the feet of the Master Christ, it's still an attachment, he says. And it's an attachment that Martha doesn't have, which is what allows her to unmoor from that better part, to actually self-sacrificially step away from that in order to love the guest Christ, the dear guest Christ, as Eckhart says, in that moment. So why he says basically Mary is a lovely but immature contemplative, the young contemplative who will someday arrive at the mature contemplative place that Martha now has arrived at, who understands that at times to be a contemplative means to put the very practices, ascetical prayer, aside in order to do what love demands in the moment. And that is to serve the neighbor in need, in this case, Christ. So if I'm in the midst of a meditation and a neighbor in need comes to the door, the rightful contemplative thing to do, the loving thing to do, is to stop meditating and address the need of my neighbor. That is what it means to be a contemplative, a mature contemplative, a contemplative in the world. So, all of this is to say, indeed, that there you see the generativity, right? There you see the generosity. I'm not saying to my neighbor, I'm sorry you're having a crisis, but I'm in the midst of aligning my chakras, which is far more important right now. So you're going to have to wait. No, the real loving thing is to say, love demands in this moment that I put aside the very thing I value most in order to be love for another. And there you see how both asceticism and prayer leads to the kind of generativity and generosity that you're talking about.
Right.
That's kind of because in a way, setting these things aside is self-sacrificial. I'm setting aside the bliss of this time I have to sit at the feet of Christ in order to do something that frankly is less desirable on some real level, to disrupt my schedule and put myself out and to set aside the things I'd rather be doing for the sake of another. And I do that born of love. And it's these practices then that actually help us detach from the practices themselves when love demands that I do that.
Yes. And then for me, the next step in this is to not judge Mary for being where she is on her developmental path, and
Right.
not to assume that Martha and Mary should be encountering the same situation with the exact same perspective and response, to know that Mary is where she is, and this is where she is on her developmental path, and Martha is where she is. And that story is so beautiful because it contrasts both of those stations of awareness and gives us an opportunity to see both and also not judge.
That's right. And, one of the ecclesial context from which Eckhart is writing as a Dominican, who Dominicans were more like mendicants who had one foot in the contemplative life and one in the active life. Dominicans are known as the great preachers of the church. So they were very active in this ministry of preaching. And he was really, the context he's writing in is to say, hold on, you cloistered contemplatives who have no active ministry in the world. Your assumption that Mary is always and necessarily the superior, meaning your assumption that your life is superior. They were really projecting their own way of life onto Mary. He's saying there's something more balanced going on here. There's another way to look at it for those of us who are Dominicans, for those of us who are contemplatives in the world. And he's sort of wresting this dominant narrative around the superiority of Mary from the monastics and saying, for those of us who are not strictly monastics, there's some value to be seen here in what Martha is indeed doing, without denying the beauty of Mary's sort of innocence and youthfulness in this. Yeah. Thanks, Sylvia. Francis, we'll close with you and then we'll move to practice. Go right ahead.
I just wanted to kind of go back to the whole references to the Ukraine, to bullies, to dead men walking, and offer something that I find helpful in challenging situations. And that is, when I am angry with someone, I find that it is helpful to stop looking at the adult self who is doing whatever it is I don't like that I'm judging, and think more about praying for their child self, the wounded child, the hurt little kid who grew up to become a bully or whatever, that makes it easier for me to open my heart more to, well, none of us live in a vacuum, and we all, the expression that bullies have been bullied and are actually hurt, that does not condone their behavior in any way, shape, or form. But I think it offers for me a crack in which to practice that more easily. So I just wanted to offer that as an observation in my own life that might help others.
Yeah, thank you, Francis. Good to see you, by the way. And yeah, it's that's a very good insight. I think sometimes praying, especially for one's enemy or opponent, or does in some ways for me open up the crack of not falling into the excess of then being judgmental toward them, and that so that it allows me the capacity to continue to see their humanity and to be present to that as well. So
one other observation, there was a man named who created something called nonviolent communication. And he was of Jewish descent and had been bullied as a child, which is what led him down the path of creating something called nonviolent communication, or as some people prefer to call it now, compassionate communication. Marshall Rosenberg, I think his name was. He ultimately was able to find compassion for Hitler. And we're talking about someone whose family had family members who had been killed in the Holocaust. And it's really challenging, but if people want to go there, that is a very interesting lecture, and I have no resource on how to find it, except he did a lecture on how he was able to do that.
Probably searchable on YouTube very easily. Yeah. Thank you, Francis. Thank you. So in just a little remaining time, let me take a moment to call up both to share our practice for next week, or this coming week, but then also to look at what we might have been doing the last 2 weeks, if anything. So for the upcoming, reflect on how your contemplative practices are inspiring you to love. What is the connection? If you're able to see the connection, if you're unable to see the connection, consider a different form of practice. What might that look like? In many ways, this comes back to, I think, the last couple of comments we've heard, and probably weave throughout much of what we've been talking about. So if both our practices and our asceticism are ultimately means to an end, and that end is to love indiscriminately, what is the connection between your current practice and loving indiscriminately? Can you discern that? Is there a direct line or thread or outcome you can discern? And if not, how might your practice need to change or alter or modify in order to help point you in that direction? That's essentially what I'm asking you to take a look at. So moderation in all things except love. How does our prayer life, our ascetical life lead us to that indiscriminate love? And then that brings us to last week's practice, or 2 weeks, 2 weeks ago now, 2 weeks, was to reflect on this question: what is the intersection between your spiritual practice and transforming action in the world? How does one flow into the other, inform one another, and sustain one another? And again, it's been a while, so it's okay if we have no further comments, but if anybody found the challenge of putting that into practice, I'd be happy to hear your thoughts on that. Okay, let me stop the share there. Any thoughts on that before we wrap up for today? Okay.
I have a quick thought.
Sure. And then Gerald, I'll come to you just after. Go right ahead.
Okay. This is Tams. I practice a breathing exercise by Jim Finley, where you breathe in love and you breathe out love. And that practice intersects with action for me as I practice it in the population and not in solitude. And it is a living reminder with each breath that the interaction that I take with my fellow man at the time that I'm doing this practice is what my heart is called to do at all times. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's what I have to share.
Yes, it makes perfect sense. Thank you, Tim. It's almost as if it puts out there the ideal that you can almost embody and attempt to live into in a concrete manner.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Tams. It's beautiful. Gerald, please. Hi to both of you.
Hi.
Sue.
Welcome from Alabama. I think what I have to say is related, and I'm sure you'll straighten me out if it isn't. I found myself getting very frustrated with the situation in Ukraine and so helpless, and feeling that the efforts that were being made by the free nations, especially America, were so inadequate and just so horrible. And then over the Easter weekend, I remembered something that you may have said it or I read, but to think of the Easter, the Paschal mystery is a metaphor for all of humanity, for all of us, that the suffering, death, and resurrection were not a one-time event. That's us. And in a very real way, the people of Ukraine are the suffering Jesus. And what I found helpful to me was the resurrection. There is a resurrection following this horrible suffering and death. And I hope it hasn't just helped me to shield or tuck that suffering away, but to have a real sense of hope and what is to be. I don't know how, I don't know when, but trusting in the resurrection.
Well, Gerald, it's very relevant, I think, and I think it's essential for what I talk about in the book is this sort of persistent Christian optimism that is really born of resurrection faith in the midst of the worst kind of atrocities that history can throw at us. It's difficult in the moment to potentially speak that to the people of Ukraine who are in the midst of their suffering, to say, oh, well, don't worry, someday the resurrection in whatever form will come through victory or peace or success. But I do think it's important that we hold that out, lest we fall into despair around the types of events like this that we're seeing unfolding. The balance, I suppose, is the balance that we hold over the course of the Triduum, which is to say you can't get to Easter Sunday without Good Friday, and Good Friday is the violence, the devastation that we're seeing unfold, and the suffering and in the bloodshed among Ukrainians. So how we hold out that optimism on their behalf is very important. It goes back to something I think Carmen was speaking of earlier. It's in that solidarity, in that we hold out the optimism of the resurrection, even if in the moment we might understand how that's a difficult thing for Ukrainians to do right now, because they're in the middle of being crucified, essentially. So how do we hold that optimism and that hope for them at a time when they're not able to hold it necessarily themselves, right? It's going to take work through the trauma and so forth that will come in the decades and maybe centuries ahead because of all this. I don't know if that helps you, Gerald, but that would be my go-to on as a response. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Yes.
Okay, that brings us to the left for 8:30. So I just want to thank you all for being here today again. I know we had a 2-week hiatus. I hope you all again had a very blessed Easter Triduum, and blessings on those Christians breathing with the other lung who will be celebrating even this weekend the joy of the resurrection. So we remain with you in prayerful solidarity and celebration of that time. And this is a special, very sacred night. So I pray you then to go and be love, to be moderate in all things except love, and to bear that and carry that to all you see and need, and go with my blessing in the name of the 3 in 1 and 1 in 3. Amen. So I look forward to seeing you then next Saturday. All right. Take care now. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you, Gerald. Bye, Sue.